Garden planning does not end once you've decided where to put your garden and where to place your beds. In fact, it's important to enter a new phase of planning because you have to decide what plants you're going to put into your beds. Today, I'm going to give you 12 things I think about and steps I take in determining what plants go in my garden. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and it's a pretty cold late fall day in my garden. Obviously, I already have snow on the ground, and I think this is a great time to get out and actually start thinking about what plants are going to go in this bed and all the other beds in my garden for the growing season next year. Because I can see the bare bones of my garden, the skeleton, so to speak, with each of these beds. There aren't plants in the way. I can see the bare soil. I can measure. I can get a really good idea of all the steps I need to take. And the first one is to actually ask myself, why do I have a vegetable garden? What am I going to be growing in the next year? And there's no single answer to this. For the most part, I'm growing vegetables in this entire space to eat. But I'm also growing to experiment. I'm growing to learn. There's so many reasons why I have a vegetable garden. But right up front, I have to start asking myself, what is it I want to accomplish in the next growing year? And that's going to influence all of the rest of the planning. It's important to identify how much space you're allocating for your vegetable garden. I have these 6 beds. They're 4 feet by 8 feet, giving me 32 square feet in each bed. And I also have the entire enclosed area behind me, where I'm going to be growing almost 300 square feet of vegetables. Once I have an idea of the space that I'm devoting for my vegetable garden, now I can move forward. But this is important. You might only have a single bed. You might only have a few pots, but you have to start off knowing exactly how much space you're going to be planting in. It's also important to identify how much time you're going to have available to garden. This is a pretty big space. And so with watering and weeding and mulching and all of the other activities that take place in a vegetable garden, I'm allocating 1 to 2 hours every single day. I have that time. You might not. And so if you start with a garden this big, but you don't give yourself enough time, well, you're probably doomed to failure from the beginning. So you have to think about what you can devote as far as attention to your garden, because I also have garden space behind me where I'll have perennials and flowers and native plants that I'm going to have to take care of. The vegetable garden isn't everything. It's a big part of my garden, but it isn't the only part of your garden. Part of the planning is figuring out, will you have enough time to grow everything that you want to? A key component in vegetable garden planning is to actually plan for the things that you're actually going to eat. It's easy to come up with a list of plants you would like to grow, but if it's not a plant that you will ever harvest and eat, well, it's often not worth the effort. And there are plants you might like to grow, but you find out you can't grow them in your garden. I'd love to grow bananas, but you can't grow bananas in a Colorado Zone 5B garden. But I can grow many other things in my diet. I eat a lot of salads, and I can grow lettuce and spinach and onions and tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers and everything else I put into a salad. So by identifying specifically each of those items on a list, now I can move forward with the other phases of planning. And then I do a value assessment of the plants that I would like to grow. I then think about whether it's worth growing. And I'll use potatoes as an example. Potatoes are extremely easy to grow in a garden, but they can take up a lot of space. Well, potatoes are also pretty cheap in my neighborhood supermarket. So I have to stop and think, is it worth the space for me to grow potatoes when I can go to the store and buy a 10-pound bag for $3? Or is that space better allocated for organic tomatoes? Because organic tomatoes are more like $5 or $6 a pound in my supermarket. And I'll be able to grow many pounds of organic tomatoes in the same space that I might have allocated for potatoes. It gets back to your diet. What is it that you eat? Now, I do eat a lot of potatoes, and I recognize that the potatoes you grow taste much better than what you can get in the store. So from a taste perspective, I've got potatoes on my list. I'm going to be growing them. I'm also going to be growing a lot of herbs that would also cost a lot in a store. So as you're looking at your list and you're doing a value assessment, you are essentially ranking the plants, because when you get to the point of the planning process where you're figuring out the space and what plants will go where, you have to think about the value that that plant will give to you. Are tomatoes more important than cucumbers? Because you might have to choose between the two. Is a butternut squash more important than a watermelon? Because you might have to choose between the two. A lot depends on the size of your garden and the priority that you've determined for the plants that you're going to grow. And then it's important to identify how much I need to grow to be able to eat once I harvest. I can grow 10 pounds of potatoes, or I can grow 50 pounds of potatoes. I can grow enough lettuce for one person. Maybe I need to grow enough lettuce for 6 people. These are important factors that need to be identified, because you'll have to figure out how many plants to put in the respective beds. Texas A&M University Extension suggests that you should have 3 tomato plants per person. And that matches up pretty closely to what I plant in my garden. I'm typically growing at least 3 tomato plants just for me, but that's an awful lot of tomatoes. If you and your family aren't eating that many tomatoes, well, then you don't need that many tomato plants. But if you're eating a lot of zucchini, well, then maybe you need a couple zucchini plants per person for your family. This is all part of it. You've identified the plants you'd like to grow, and you've prioritized which ones should go in your garden. Well, now you need to start quantifying that based on how it fits into your diet. And different plants will produce different amounts of harvest. I like beets. Well, a single beet might be enough for a single dinner. How many times am I really going to eat beets during the growing season? 25, maybe? Well, I can plan to grow 25 beet plants. There are plants like tomatoes that will keep producing, but when it comes to the carrots and the beets and a lot of those root crops, well, that's a single harvest. And I'll talk about that here in just a little bit, but the idea is, how many carrots do I think I need? How many beets do I think I need? How many radishes do I think I need? How many zucchini plants do I need? Based on my family, your family, how much each member of the family eats, let's get a rough idea at this point so we can begin to plan out just how big our garden needs to be based on the plants that we've identified. It's also important to look beyond just what will be eaten during the growing season. I like to think about food preservation. Which of these plants am I going to preserve throughout the growing season? I like to make pickles, and so pickling cucumbers are on my list. Well, how many jars am I going to pickle? I have to allow for enough plants to give me all the pickles I want. And I might want to grow 1 or 2 extra tomato plants for the purpose of preservation. This is where determinate tomatoes might be perfect. I'll plan for enough determinate tomato plants so that I can make some tomato sauce when all of those tomatoes come into harvest. Think about that at this point, because it's wonderful to go out and eat a fresh cherry tomato or pull a radish from the ground, but if you want to preserve a lot of your harvest, this is the time to start thinking about it. And so with an idea of what plants that I'm probably going to be growing this year, now I can get back into the garden and start thinking about the actual space. So between these 6 beds and that whole area off to the side, I'm going to have almost 500 square feet of growing space. Now that's a lot, and you'll need to downsize appropriately as you figure out what plants are going to go where. But with this idea in mind, now I can take the individual beds that I'm going to be growing in. I use paper, you can do this electronically, but I can actually come up with an individual plan for each of these beds and place that into the overall plan for the garden as I move forward. And time re-enters the planning process. Not the amount of time that I'm spending at this point, but the amount of time that it takes for the plants to grow to harvest, because that's a big reason why we're doing this. And don't think that it's a single plant in a single bed for the entire season. You have to take the list, take all the considerations that we've discussed so far and figure out where all of the individual plants are going to go. It can be relatively easy with a single bed. It becomes more complicated with the more beds you have. And you have to think about the time of the season as far as the plants are concerned, because they like different conditions. In this bed, I may start with lettuce and radish and kale and beets, the kind of plants that like cool weather. I can get them started in spring. I'll have everything harvested by early summer. So now in this same bed, I can put in squash or cucumber or tomatoes or melons. And that's how you move forward with the planning. Not just a single page for the single beds, but succession planting, a progression through the season. Because at the end of the season, when those plants are done, I can put in more plants in this same bed, more of the lettuce and radish and beets. That's all part of the planning. And so, as I start thinking about which individual plants will be going in my individual beds, I now also start thinking about the production of those plants. Beets are a one-shot plant. You pull it up and you're done. But I could be harvesting the greens from those beets. So maybe I'll be growing some beets in this bed to pull up and use the beet root, and maybe I'll be growing some beets in this bed to grow for the leafy greens that the beets can produce. Maybe I only need 1 zucchini plant in this bed, but I'll need 6 cucumber plants in this bed. It all starts tying back into how much I want to eat and how much I want to harvest. And I have to realize how these different plants will grow in completely different ways depending on what I'm harvesting from the plant and how much of that plant I want to grow throughout the season. And so now, with all of these factors in mind, a plan is starting to come together. I've identified what I want to grow, what I need to grow, what I can grow, and gotten a general idea of where they're going to go and how I'm going to implement succession planting. Well, now we can actually start thinking about, are we going to grow from seed or are we going to use transplants? Now, in my area, peppers and tomatoes and eggplants do best when I put a plant in the ground rather than a seed. But I can grow cucumbers and squashes and melons directly from seed. By going back through my list, I can take this next step, which is determining, is it going to be a plant that I grow from seed or buy from a nursery? If I do grow it from seed, how early do I need to start it indoors? If it's a plant, how late can I wait for either my own plant or the nursery plant? That all ties into the timing as well, because I have to figure out when these plants are going to go in the ground. If I haven't considered that as part of my planning, well, it's kind of a house of cards and everything can fall apart. And for those plants that I can grow from seed, well, I think it's really important to check to see if maybe I already have the seed, and I too often forget this step or just flat out ignore it. I know I want to grow sugar pumpkins so that I can make delicious pumpkin pies in fall. Well, I already have a package of sugar pumpkin seeds. as do I have a package of Boston pickling cucumbers. Both of those are on my list. I can check them off. I don't need to buy those seeds. But if I come across something on my list where I can't find the seeds I already have, now I'll put a little star to identify that I need to buy those seeds. I want to grow stinging nettle this year. I know I have never bought those seeds before. So stinging nettle is on my list. I need to buy stinging nettle seeds. By going step by step through everything I've identified up to this point, I can move forward. And this helps save money and avoids wasting a lot of the seeds I might already have. These are all preliminary steps as you begin your vegetable garden planning. And none of this is set in stone. I have no doubt that some of the plants I've identified for my list won't make it into my garden, because I know others will find their way onto this list as I continue this process, especially after I look through a catalog like Baker Creek. I'm going to find plants that I want to grow. But by doing this on a cold, wintry day, it gives you time to be able to buy the seeds you need and time to change your list as necessary. It's an evolving planning process, and allow the time for that evolution. Because if you wait until it's sunny out and the soil is warm, you may have missed the window of opportunity to get some of these plants into the ground. There's more to this planning process, and I will make many more videos in the future, and I've already made many videos that are in the Gardener Scott library. I encourage you find out as much information as you can before you start putting some plants in the ground. And I'll be sure and put a few links to videos at the end of this one. But until that point, get your plan together. Start figuring out what you want, where it's going to go, and you're setting yourself up for much better gardening success. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.